Were you surprised about what you saw in the video of the documentary Who Killed the Electric Car? It's interesting, actually. It's dramatic, but it's not that surprising. Incumbents, large firms typically, they are very slow to react to innovation, and even if they have sometimes the innovation in-house, there are forces inside the company that end up killing the project. That's actually very typical. When I was doing my master's and doctorate student, I actually was a research assistant for a professor who had a very interesting phrase. He called it that organizations, particularly large organizations, are in a state that is always of dynamic conservatism, which is they're conservative in the sense that they don't want change. But they're not just passively conservative, they're actually dynamically conservative, which means that actually they defend themselves against change. And that's actually what you saw in the video. You saw a company like GM coming with a product way ahead of the competitors, 12 years before Tesla in the market, and still sort of, you know, defending itself against that innovation that had been bred inside the company. So it's actually interesting. You know, so one of the things that I have been studying in my research is how companies corporations respond to innovation, and oftentimes, you know, companies that are slow to respond, they will resort to a particular strategy, which I call the hybrid strategy. And what that is simple. Actually, these companies, what they do is that they mix all technology that they know very well and they're experts in, with some elements of the new technology to produce a product that is a hybrid. So technically a product that mixes the old technology and the new technology. And they do that for an obvious reason. First of all, is that they never want to let go of the old technology, their old business model and stuff like that. But at the same time, they don't want to be accused of not doing anything about the new technology. So the way it's a little bit of a safe face kind of response, and they produce hybrids. And there are many examples of these hybrids. Kodak was very famous when they were disrupted by digital photography. They actually came out with something called the photo CD, which was a crazy product, very expensive. And what it did is it was just a chemical-based camera that then you had to buy a separate piece of equipment to transform that into digital photos. So what you had at the end, you had both worlds, the old world and the new world, in a very cumbersome and expensive piece of equipment. There are many examples like that. You know, in the 70s, when Sony decided to use transistors, which by that time actually were a new technology, to create pocket radios, you know, transistor radios. The US counterparts here, the US companies, they tried to react to that. And what they did is that they created radios that mix a little bit of the old and the new technology. So they had some tubes, they had some transistors, and of course they were much bulkier, much bigger. And of course they didn't work either. So what happens with hybrids, and I think is actually very interesting, is that hybrids have two big problems for incumbents. When they follow that strategy, I call it a trap, actually. I call this the hybrid trap. And the reason I call it a trap is because there are two key problems with it. You know, one is that it gives these companies a false sense of safety. Like, you know, we're doing this, but in reality they're not. They're actually kind of still tied up to the old technology. And that's complicated because it delays decision making, and, you know, and it comes, you know, with all sort of internal problems with resistance and stuff like that. But the second most important problem actually is that focusing on hybrids doesn't allow the companies to rethink their product, redesign their products in order to take full advantage of the new technology. And so you end up with a product which is cumbersome, it's more costly because you have to have both technologies, and at the same time it doesn't perform as well. So it's nor this nor that, and therefore it kind of falls in the middle. You know, like going back to the example of transistor radios, you know, when the Sony came out with a huge innovation of putting a small radio that you can put in your pocket as a transistor radio, they actually took, because transistors use a lot less power than the old vacuum tubes, they reduced everything, all the components, you know, the capacitors, the battery packs and everything, and so they could come out with a very small product. Now, if you don't do that, if you actually do like a little bit of it and a little bit of the old, you can never have this total redesign of the product, and that's a huge problem for companies. So, so I think, you know, what happens today is that you look at an example such as General Motors and the electric car and what Tesla did, and you realize that it's actually incredible that a company, a new startup, could actually challenge the big companies like GM and Toyota and all the others. And it's not surprising that the company that has been slowest in jumping into electric cars in terms of announcing electric car designs and stuff like that has been Toyota, which is, by the way, from the beginning, the pioneer and the largest company in producing hybrids. So, getting yourself into hybrids will probably delay your entry into the innovation full-fledged into the new technology. How did Tesla do it? I mean, how comes, a startup could actually challenge the incumbents in a big industry, which these are international companies, very large. And of course, I'm not saying that Tesla will necessarily succeed. They have lots of problems. In fact, this week, as I was coming to do this recording, they are already in the news because of all the volatility of the CEO and some of the stuff that is going on. But the reality is that Tesla is today in a position that is a challenger. No question, is a challenger, and is perceived by most people as the innovator of an industry that has, was in much need for innovation. So why do I say is it interesting to look at how they did it? Because if you look at this, I'm going to put in the screen now a very classical framework to understand when companies can succeed with innovation. And this is a framework coming from a famous professor, Richard Tees, that has this idea that innovation needs to be, as you see now in the screen, innovation needs to be needs to come together with a series of assets that he calls complementary assets to the innovation that will help you succeed in the market. Because at the end of the day, you can have a good idea, you can have even a good product, a good prototype, but if you don't have the distribution channels, if you don't have the manufacturing facilities, if you don't have the capacity to advertise your product and to get into the channels, then you won't succeed, even if you had a great idea. And so he came up with this framework that you see in the screen, where innovation is at the center. But in addition to that, you need all the things that go around innovation, that are all of these complementary assets. That if you don't have them, you can have a hard time competing. And so things like distribution, things like manufacturing, and if you think of it, if you go back to Tesla when they started in 2006 or so, they didn't have any of those complementary assets. They didn't have manufacturing capability. They didn't have even design capability. They didn't have distribution capability. And so how comes a company in a market that needs all of those capabilities to be successful, how comes they actually succeed? And I think what happens, is that they were given a gift, basically, by the incumbents of the industry that were focusing on hybrid products and therefore delayed their own decisions to enter the electric car industry. And those 12 years, which is basically 10 to 12 years that were gifted to Tesla to start building those assets. And if you have that amount of time, and of course, with investors that are willing to support you, you can start building those assets. And in fact, this is exactly what Tesla did. They actually did, build a mega factory for the production of batteries, which is a very important resource in the electric car industry. They did actually build a network of supercharging stations throughout the country, and Mexico and Canada and Europe, that now actually Tesla users can use. So all of that would have been impossible to do if the competition had come 12 years before, right away when they started with their project. There are many examples that show that how incumbents can respond quickly, and if they have the complementary assets, they can actually stop the new entrants. The most famous example is EMI, the music company based in the UK, which that was famous when they signed the Beatles as part of their lineup. EMI, actually, I'm not sure if you know this, but when you go and do a scanner on your, a brain or a chest or a leg or something, that technology, the scanning technology for medical purposes, was actually invented by EMI, the recording company, which is kind of fun. And of course, what EMI did, they actually tried to enter that market, the market for scanning for medical purposes. And they were, for 2 or 3 years, they were the leaders of the industry because they came out, first movers. But they didn't have those complementary assets. They didn't have distribution system. They didn't have, the knowledge of the market, the contacts in the different hospitals and stuff like that. And the incumbents, actually, unlike the incumbents in the auto industry, the incumbents in the medical equipment industry reacted very quickly. And they very quickly went into put a lot of money into R&D. And very soon they had similar machines than the ones that EMI had, but they also had the contacts, all of these complementary assets, manufacturing capabilities. And in a space of 3 or 4 years, EMI had lost their leadership, and in a space of 5 or 6, they were gone from the industry. So I think the Tesla example compared to the EMI example and the scanner is actually quite an interesting contrast. So Tesla today is actually dominating the market. If you can see in this other figure that is going to be in the screen in a second, Tesla is now by far the largest producer in the market. In fact, today, the new model, the most economical model, which is the Model 3, is actually, at this day, we're ending in the summer of 2018, and they're already producing about, they're reaching the milestone of 5,000 cars per week, which means that they actually can have a profitable production. And at that rate, the Tesla Model 3 will be actually one of the best-selling cars in the US by the end of 2018, which is quite an amazing feat for a company that started not too long ago.